Good to be here. Always good to be here.
Nice to have you here. And can I ask, how was Michael Bublé?
Great concert. He's an amazing entertainer.
Do you have a favourite song?
I should probably remember now, but...
But they're all good, aren't they?
They're all
He's got a brand new album
fantastic,
out as well.
yes.
But we're not here to talk about music because you know politics. What's been happening, Mathias?
Well, as you say, I've just come back from a week in Canberra, and we've, as we've been doing for the last few months, we've been talking yet about a whole series of new Labor Party taxes. We've had the flat tax, the carbon tax, the mining tax, student taxes, and of course there's also now the broken promise the government will not be having a tax summit by the end of June.
Matthias, why do you think the government, I mean I know, but why do you think the government is bringing in all these taxes? Because it's very rare that a government wants to bring in taxes. It's sort of an instant death at the next election.
Well, it's a government that's addicted to spending, and in order to feed the addiction to spending, they've got to tax more. That's essentially the short answer.
And to get these tax changes through the parliament, how will they do that? They've got a minority government. Will they rely on the independents? Well,
I mean, that's what's been happening. In terms of the flat tax, they've been trying to get enough people on board, and it looks as if they've been successful. But I mean, our point is that really it is time to have a more strategic view at our tax system. There ought to be a proper, inclusive, transparent tax reform process that focuses on lower, simpler and fairer taxes. And that was, of course, what the tax summit was supposed to be about, which was to happen by 30 June, and it's now not going to happen.
And tell me about the other taxes that are coming, because I know flood tax has been a popular one in the parliament.
Well, it's not all that popular on our side.
No, I know. I've seen Tony Abbott censure the Prime Minister all this week on different
taxes.
Taxes. What about the carbon tax? What's happening with that?
Well, I mean, the carbon tax was manifestly a broken promise. I mean, the Prime Minister went to the last election adopting coalition policy because she knew that's what she had to say in order to have a chance to win the election. So she said there would be no carbon tax under the government she leads, and now we've got one.
We've got the proof as well. Let's have a look at this footage.
Julia Gillard, Prime Minister, before the last election.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, after ordering his defence forces to open fire on civilians.
My people with me, they love me all.
The opposition couldn't resist.
Julia Gillard, nearly Gaddafi-like, saying, "My people love me, my people love me."
She's as deluded as Colonel "My people love me" Gaddafi.
There you go. That was said by the Prime Minister just before the federal election. So I noticed that Tony Abbott has been holding her to task on that promise.
Well, I mean, fundamentally, the carbon tax is a bad policy because in the absence of what is described as an appropriately comprehensive global agreement on emissions trading, all it does is push up the price of everything in Australia. It'll cost jobs in Australia without actually doing anything to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. So people with the carbon tax are being asked to make a sacrifice without actually achieving anything beneficial for the environment. And that is, of course, why this debate was settled before the last election, and both major parties made a commitment not to have a carbon tax over this term of parliament.
Changed?
Well, I mean, what changed is that Julia Gillard lost the election. I mean, she had a very bad... She's now in a minority government. And Bob Brown, Green Senator Bob Brown, is running the show.
Some are referring to him as the Prime Minister.
Well, I mean, if you look at him in the Parliament, I sit quite close to him in the Senate, and you can really feel that sense of power and the testosterone sort of building up in him. And he feels very powerful right now.
They've accused him last week of hijacking the Prime Minister's courtyard and hijacking a lot of the Prime Minister's comments before she goes out to make them. There's been a meeting, and then she comes out and repeats exactly what Bob Brown wants.
Well, the carbon tax was discussed between the Prime Minister and Bob Brown, but she didn't take it to her own Labor Party caucus. So her own members and senators are very annoyed with the Prime Minister that it looks as if the Prime Minister trusts Green Senator Bob Brown more than she trusts her own team. And of course, that is not a way to run public policy.
We remember before the election and after the election of a minority government, there was supposed to be a reform in Parliament. Less arguing, more working together. That's gone out the window, because I've watched the last week where the opposition leader has censured the Prime Minister nearly every day. And
she deserved to be censured, Fred.
How do you think, and where is this going to go? Because the people at home will either say they support Tony Abbott, or they may say he's gone too far. Do you think that there's people out there that want the Liberal Party just to pass these taxes?
Well, I mean, introducing a carbon tax has got significant implications for our economy. It's got significant implications for people's quality of life. So from that point of view, given that it's such an emphatic, broken promise, we have a responsibility to scrutinise what the Prime Minister is doing. So, I mean, I think that the Australian people would expect us to put the pressure on to make sure that the Prime Minister is required to justify her actions.
And what's happening with detention centres? I heard only a couple of days ago, the Prime Minister announced that there's going to be a new building in, is it Darwin? They're building a new detention centre for 900 refugees. Where does the Liberal Party stand on this? Because that's another broken promise.
Well, I mean, we had a policy in the lead up to the last election to stop the boats. And of course, we've done that previously in government, like we have stopped the boats before. Julia Gillard, in the lead up to the last election, again, she sought to adopt a Liberal Party policy. She went into marginal seats like Lindsay and talked about reintroducing offshore processing. She wanted to do it in East Timor, which we didn't think would ever work. We said we should go back to Nauru. The reality is, Julia Gillard, before the election, supported offshore processing, and after the election, she now says, "Well, we've got to continue to process people onshore."
Mathias, what's the strategy long term? I mean, we've got at least 2 more years to go with this Parliament, 2.5 years. What's happening?
Well, our strategy is we want to make this government work hard. We want to force them to keep their promises, and where they don't keep their promises, to expose that. And, you know, obviously there is a decision to be made by the independents, because every failure of the Labor government is also a failure for Mr Windsor and Mr Oakeshott, because they are part of this Labor government, and to the extent that people in their electorates want to hold them to account, then that's obviously something that we would encourage.
I mean, we hear every day that the government has problems putting through its legislation, but then a couple of days later you hear that independent senators, the Greens, they all support it, it goes through. So where does the Liberal Party stand where it can't block any of this legislation?
Well, I mean, from our point of view, we want to be the Australian government. So it's not so much, I mean, so we will always transparently put forward our position on any particular issue. We can't block anything in our own right. We don't have a majority in the Senate, we don't have a majority in the House of Representatives.
You don't think you can win over the independents?
And this is the point. All we can ever do is argue the merits of a particular policy, and if we can convince other people in the Parliament to support our point of view, then the Parliament will vote any particular way. But the reality here is things are going to change quite dramatically from 1 July onwards, because that's when the Greens will have... yeah, that's right. That's when the Greens will have the balance of power in the Senate. And looking at what's been happening over the last few weeks, I think that is going to cause Julia Gillard and the Australian people all sorts of headaches.
Well, she has been looking very uncomfortable in the Parliament.
She's been looking weak,
She's going overseas for a couple of weeks and then coming back to Parliament again. Do you think the pressure is going to be put on by Tony Abbott? Because I think he's performing very well at the moment.
Well, I mean, Tony Abbott is working very hard to hold this government to account, to hold this Prime Minister to account, and to make this government work hard for the Australian people.
He does have the term, they give him the term the wrecker, the no-sayer. How do you feel about that when the people say, oh, all you do is you're a wrecker, you don't approve of anything, you're always saying no?
Well, Tony Abbott does not approve of broken promises, but Tony Abbott is a very, very positive leader, and he provides very, very positive leadership. And of course, like, I mean, the government, of course, would say that, wouldn't they? I mean, whenever they can't get their way with yet another tax, with yet another broken promise, of course they'd say, well, you know, you block everything.
Do you see polls? I mean, have you seen polls on what people think on the carbon tax issue and also immigration?
I'm a politician. We don't watch the polls,
no,
Fred.
But,
You know that.
You've seen. I'm sure you've seen what people are thinking.
Well,
about
I
this.
mean, we've seen the published polls, and the published polls are not looking very good for this government. And look, it will be interesting to see how that is going to trend moving forward.
How would you? What would the opposition say would be the alternative to the flood tax? How would you handle that issue?
The important thing on the flood tax is that it's only supposed to come effect on 1 July 2011. So after the next budget, we're 2 months away from the budget. $350 billion is our annual budget in Australia, and they want to raise $1.8 billion through a new tax. Why would they not have waited for the budget to have a look at the whole budget, make spending cuts, reprioritise? And I mean, if anybody has got $350 in their pocket, surely they can find $2 in order to deal with a change priority. And that is really what this is about. So what we've said, rather than to go the easy way of whacking on yet another tax, taking advantage of people's goodwill towards the reconstruction effort in Queensland, which is very important, what we're saying is, Look at all your wasteful spending across your whole budget and find the $2 out of 350 that you need to deal with it. Yeah.
Good point. Thank Mathias Cormann, please, in the studio. Senator Mathias Cormann, the Liberal Party Senator for WA, and we'll have him back on the show very soon as well. We're going to keep him talking politics, and Ken White will join us as well. And can I just say quickly, we have offered the opportunity to the Labor Party, and it's not that we're being biased, they keep knocking us back. So where they say everybody else says no, so does the Labor Party at times.